Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to day 3 of our LAC Summit. I'm here with Matthew Savage, who is going to give an amazing keynote. And before we do that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this summit because it's such a great learning opportunity brought to you by the LAC, the Learning Analytics Collaborative, and Constellations Education. So my name is Emma Burns. I'm the Professional Learning Coordinator at Constellations. And we're all about sharing information and sharing learning, which is why we're doing this today. It's a great opportunity for schools to share where they're at in their journey of building a culture of data use. And so I really encourage you to go and have a look at some of the other sessions because they've been so informative. If you're not already aware, I just want to let you know a little bit about the Learning Analytics Collaborative and what we do. If you've got any questions after this call, please reach out and we can arrange a demo call. But as you can see, we are a platform and a service for schools that want to use learning analytics to improve and to transform. Our mission is to support you to build cultures of data use. So the way we do that is we collect all the data that you have in the school, not only academic grades, we also collect demographic data, well-being data, street data, everything. And we collaborate with you to figure out the best way to present that data as information. And then we teach users how to use that information so that they can gain insight about their learners. We have over 100 pre-built visualizations, and each one of them has been customized to answer the questions that schools have. We have dashboards for teachers wanting to know about their classes and seeing different kinds of assessment all in one place. We've got dashboards for specialists, for example, EAL or learning support specialists who want to understand the impact of their interventions. We've got dashboards for admin and board, HR teams, people who need to see the aggregate data. And we have dashboards for parents and students who need to see a zoomed in look at one student's data over time. We've got over 50 schools in our collaborative from all over the world. And as I mentioned, we're all about sharing the learning. We're a collaborative. So when one school develops a new use case or a new visualization, we share that information with other schools so that everyone can learn and grow. And one of the ways we're doing that is with this virtual summit. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker right now, Matthew Savage. He's a friend of the LAC. He's also a consultant for Wellbeing and DEIJB, and he's the founder of the Mona Lisa Effect. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew, who's going to share with us about how we keep data kind and warm. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's going to bring my slides to the fore. So yeah, welcome to 25 minutes with Matthew. As Emma said, I'm very much a friend of the LAC in the work that I do for what I call the Mona Lisa effect, which is an intentional strategy to help ensure every single child, without condition or exception, can be seen, be heard, be known, and belong. And data is very much a core part of that. And by data, I don't just mean numbers any more than the LAC does. I also mean information. I mean, ultimately, stories. And in this presentation today, we're going to be looking at what I call tessellations, constellations, and fractal patterns, and specifically how we keep data both kind and warm. I thought I'd start just by introducing what I call my data cycle. Why do we collect any sort of data in the first place in a school? We collect it in order to answer two key questions. On the one hand, we need to be able to answer the who am I for each of the students in our school. If any of them were metaphorically to come up to us and say, who am I? We should be able to answer that with depth, with empathy, and with understanding, cognizant of the fact that they're actually hiding a lot of who they are, with the many manifold masks that the system incentivizes them to wear. So how can we answer that first question? And once we've tried to answer that first question for as many of our students as possible, we can then step back and answer a second equally important question, which is the who are we? Who are we as a school? Who are we as a community? Who are we in terms of our culture and our climate? And this is not the who are we in terms of what our guiding statements say we are, or who are we in terms of our marketing collateral and who that says we are. This is the actually who are we now? Who would we like to be? And therefore, how can we get there? So these questions are core to the ways in which I help schools use data around the world. And I encourage them to use data in 4 different ways. To use data kindly, um, intentionally, with kindness and well-being at the core of our data strategy. To use data warmly, and that's all about context, and I'll come up to that in a little bit. To use data at a street level, Emma referred to street data early on, and for me, street data is the data that we gather, the stories that we gather from the groups and individuals we've identified as being on the edges of visibility, on the margins. And with all of that, we can then step back, slow down, be patient, and dig into the soil of that culture and climate such that we can make sustainable adaptations that bring more students in from the cold in the future. And like any good cycle, it continues to spin. And sometimes we have to go back on ourselves because something we found leads us to want to go back and find out more. This keynote is focusing in particular, however, on kind data and on warm data. So what do I mean by kind data? Well, I refer here to the data science anthropologist Hugo Baun-Anderson, who says that if we want to do data science, as presumably all of us here do, we need to recognize that it's a technical, cultural, economic, and social discipline that has the power to consolidate and rearrange societal power structures. In other words, data can and it will change the world, but how we use it will determine whether it changes the world for good or for ill. And in schools, as microcosms of the wider society, again, how we use data in schools will determine whether that data is used for good or for ill with our students. Some of you will be familiar with the Lifeboat Story, which is a central tenet of the history of eugenics in many ways. And the story goes as follows, that you've got a lifeboat with 50 seats on it, and there are 100 drowning people in the water around the lifeboat. And how do we decide which of those drowning people to bring on board to safety? And history is strewn with brutal and violent articulations of that decision-making process. But they're also rife within our schools. We're forever deciding which students have more or less worth, which versions of success are more or less valuable, whose well-being matters more or less to us. In Tim Burton's reimagining of Lewis Carroll's story, Alice talks about how even though it's her dream she's in, she feels done to. She feels like she's been shrunk and stretched and scratched and stuffed into teapots. And it seems to me that that's what we have done and continue to do to our students in terms of the data we gather on them. Data is something that happens to children rather than something which contributes to their nurturing and their holistic development. And in that way, I guess we could talk about data being potentially an act of violence or an act of kindness. And again, therefore, data is a choice for us because we need to choose as educators, as leaders, and as those in the analytics field, we need to choose, will we be using data in such a way that commits these acts of violence, or will it be a tool for kindness and compassion and putting well-being first? In her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, Cathy O'Neill talks about how problematic narrow definitions of success are. She talks about how for her family, she makes a meal each evening and she has a criterion for what is a successful meal. And that criterion is if the kids all eat loads of vegetables. Whereas if her youngest child were to say what his criterion was for a successful meal, it would be loads of Nutella. And the point is that in this scenario, she is in control, she's in power, she is in the position of authority. Therefore, she decides what success does and doesn't look like. And everyone else has to fall in with that. And in the same way, in schools, what success looks like and how it can be demonstrated in a valid way is too often determined by those of us with power and authority, i.e., the adults in the school, or worse still, the adults outside of the school in the abstract world of exam criteria and assessment objectives. So there you've got a classic example of how data can be used kindly or cruelly. The more I, as a student, feel that I can co-construct the version of success against which I will measure myself, the more kind will be the effect of that data. Many of you will be familiar with Pereth's Invisible Women. And here there's very much a focus on those on the margins, those on the edges of visibility, and how it's those marginalized groups who suffer the blunt and violent end of data. And here she says, for anyone who's used to jarring up against a world that has not been designed around them. And the argument she's making in this book is that big data, algorithms, to which Cathy O'Neill refers, are all there to advantage the already advantaged, to center the already centered. And our schools do that, I think, too much. Too rarely do we as schools say in a convincing and compelling way to our students, you know what, you are enough. You don't need fixing, you don't need curing, you don't need repairing, you don't need bettering. Actually, you as a human being, whole as you are at the moment, are enough. And you know what? The love and affection we have for you as a student in our school is not contingent on anything. It is unconditional love. And it might seem strange in a keynote around data to be talking about unconditional love, but I think that children and young people today see contingency and conditionality all around them. They will have worth if this. They will have value if that. They will be valued if they do this or say that or perform in this way. So our job is to use data in such a way that removes a lot of that conditionality and is intentionally and unconditionally kind and loving. Sometimes with schools, I conduct a data inventory where I get them to put down on pieces of paper all of the different pieces of data that they have in their school at the moment, similar to that first level of Emma's triangle a bit earlier on. And then we can start to evaluate those pieces of data through different lenses. For example, which of those pieces of data are used consistently, down to which are used with no consistency whatsoever, which of those pieces of data have demonstrable, palpable impact, and which have no impact that we can see at all. And on different scales, which are the most inclusive pieces of data? Pieces of data which represent worlds in which every child can succeed and enjoy success, and which are really exclusive. We see this a lot in attitudes to learning or effort grades in reports in schools around the world, where essentially the criteria for positive attitudes to learning or behaviors for learning constitute a description of a neurotypical child. And therefore, if you happen to be neurodivergent, you're never going to be included within that version of success. Which pieces are fixed and which are organic, which are co-constructed and which are unilateral, which are kind and which are harmful. And when we evaluate the different pieces of our data sky, if you like, we can start then to look at how the different parts of that data evaluation compare with each other. For example, if we look at consistency against kindness, we can then form a set of quadrants. So in the top left, we've got pieces of data that are used really consistently, but actually with no kindness and with a propensity towards data violence. Or we have those pieces of data which are both really kind and really consistent, or those which are neither consistent nor kind, or those which are really kind but aren't used in a consistent fashion. And in this way, you can actually put any of those scales alongside each other, really to sift and to evaluate whether you're using data in a way that does kids good rather than harm. The warm bit of the data cycle is, as I said earlier, about context. And I love these graphics. Some of the people who've worked with me before will recognize these. But we have here on the left-hand side a famous painting by Van Gogh called Bedroom in Arles. About 10 years ago, I think, the performance artist Ursus Verli conducted a project that he called Tidying Up Art. So he took this rich, vibrant, warm, and alive scene and he tidied it up. And in many ways, it seems much more ordered. It seems to be a much more navigable map. Everything is in a very logical place in some respects, but in other respects, it's devoid of meaning because it's devoid of context. It's devoid of warmth. This is a really cold environment. And too often, I think when we pluck one piece of data out of its context, we're essentially doing to that warmth, that vivacity, that energy of that student life. We are robbing it of that context and we're robbing it of that warmth and we're rendering it cold. Look what happens here. If I flip it the other way, this is what Verli has done to a famous painting by Sheila, Reclining Female Nude. He's taken all of the constituent parts, he's robbed them of their context, and he's put them in order, logical order in this way, thereby not just robbing the original of its warmth, but actually effecting an act of brutalization on that warm reality. And we just need to be really careful about this because I think schools operate in silos far too much. We have socio-emotional learning, which is over here. Then we have the academics, which is here. And then we have CAS, which is over here. And then we have this bit of data over here and this bit over there. And we have behavior somewhere else entirely, as if we operate in an ecosystem where all of those things are somehow disconnected. Whereas we know that all of those things form a rich interrelational web, an ecosystem in which every part relies on the other. Nora Bateson recognizes this really powerfully here, where she talks about the danger that if we don't take account of that interrelationality, we're going to inspire bad decisions and we're going to make already wicked problems even worse. So the warm data piece is about context. In your school, you have a sky full of data stars, a data galaxy, if you like. And all of these pieces of data represent different parts of each student and each group of students in your school. And our job as educators and as leaders and as data analysts is to look up at that sky, look up at the firmament in the same way that the very first human beings will have done so long ago, and try and make sense of it. And we make sense of things often by reading stories into them. And that was the basis for the original kind of idea of a constellation. We draw together what we think are the most important stars, and we let them form a constellation which tells a story, which helps us sense make. Now, we need to sense make about each of the complex concoctions of synapses and hormones, which is every single child in front of us. We need to sense make there. We do so by looking at all of those data stars and trying to draw them together into a constellation. And this begins ultimately with triangulation, looking at the different types of data pieces we have and seeing how they interact with each other. how they derive from and reside in each other. On the one hand, we have in a really highly effective data-rich school, we have data around kids' strengths and their needs. We also have data around their attainment, their achievement, and their progress. And we have data around their well-being and belonging. But each of those three parts relies upon the other two and also impacts the other two. So constellations and tessellations and fractal patterns begin with triangles. And this, I think, is a really powerful one in helping you to really get a grasp of how contextualization and warm data works within your school environment. The province of Ontario offers us this in their growing success model, where they argue that to truly get to know a student or a group of students, you need to get to know them through observation, through conversation, and through product. Now, if you look at lots of early years settings, you'll see a real embracing of observational and conversational data, but not very much product at all. You look at many IB or A-level classrooms, and there's an obsession with product with virtually no reliance on observation or conversation at all. And the optimal way of getting to know each child, of being able to answer their who am I, is to get a balance between these three sides of the triangle. And each three of those can actually be applied to each of these. So suddenly we don't just have one triangle, we have three triangles on each of the sides of this one triangle. This is what I mean by the fractal patterns that we're starting to grow. And then if we think about what data that we have is about our students' past, what data that we have is about our students' presence, and what data that we have that's about our students' futures, because we could apply each of those three things to each of these three things about each of these three things. And then we could start to think in terms of where is the data generated? Is the data generated by parents about the students? Because some really valuable data comes from parents. Is it generated by students, or is it generated by teachers? And again, you could then apply those three things to each of these three things about each of these three things about each of these three things, and so on and so forth, before this is what you have. And this is the beginnings of that data sky, if you like, and those data constellations. And the more that we can be warm in the way that we can textualize data intentionally in schools, the more we look beyond the emergent part of each student and group of students, what we see above the surface, maybe the masks that they wear, and the more we can start to dig into the soil beneath that emergence, the more we can truly understand what is it like to be that kid. What is it like to be in that group of kids? What is it like to be a student in our school? Who are we? And it's that digging that I'm talking about there, which for me is the really exciting part of the data journey. When you draw on those tessellations and constellations and fractal patterns of different data stars forming different data constellations to dig around in the soil of your school's culture and climate. And you look at adaptation of that soil as your main goal, thereby preventing you from feeling like you have to run around like a headless chicken playing that whack-a-mole game where you sort all of these problems all the time and other ones will continue to sprout up. And our dashboards have to empower us to do this. Our dashboards have to show data in a warm way. They have to show data together rather than there being, we look at this part of our analytics to see the socio-emotional learning data. We look at this part of the analytics to see what the report grades were last cycle. We look at this part to show this. We've got to create and develop dashboards that show all of the core parts of a kid's data story together in one place. And the more we do this at a grade level, at a section level, at a school level, even at a school group level, the more the data becomes an equity scanner. The more the data enables us to find the kids and the groups of children and young people on our margins and to do something about that. And if we do this effectively and thoroughly, it's all about a really comprehensive net. So nobody can slip through it. Because most schools with whom I first start to work have a pretty strong net, and a lot of their kids don't fall through that net. But as long as we've got some who are slipping to the coldness and the invisibility of those margins, then we are not meaningfully pursuing DEIJB. It reminds me of this poem by Stevie Smith, where she's talking about the difference between waving and drowning. And in this poem, this becomes a metaphor for her struggles in life. That just as if you look at someone out at sea and their arms are in the air, you're not sure whether they're waving or drowning. Maybe the optimist in you assumes that they are waving, but you don't actually know. And she reflects on her own life and how, to a large extent, she's been drowning a lot of it, but others around her have assumed she was just waving. And that's, I suppose, the sobering thought with which I'll leave you as we move to the very end of this keynote is, do you know the difference in your school? Do you know the kids who are waving, and do you know the kids who are drowning? And if we accept that the system incentivizes inauthenticity to a large extent, then probably the answer is no, you don't, which is why we need the data to help us see and discover those children. Then what we're doing is intentionally kind. We are shunning violence and exclusivity, and we're trying to ensure that every child is found. I think I've managed to do that even a minute before the 4:30 end of the talk. So we've got time for any of the members of the live audience here, if there were any questions, or if you had any questions yourself, Emma. But in terms of the provocation from me, I hope that that's given a narrative that makes sense and that resonates in terms of the way in which you use data in schools.
Absolutely, so much, Matthew. Every time I hear you speak, I come away with a new understanding of the way that you think about data and the way that you think about students. And so thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. I do have questions, but I want to hand over to our live audience as well. Does anybody have any questions for Matthew? Please feel free. Yeah, Supriya.
Yeah. Matthew, that was very interesting to learn about the Mona Lisa effect, and I would want to read more about it. But I just want to know, is it the demographic data we use, or we can use academic data plus well-being? All of it can be put into kind and warm data analysis?
I think all data can and should be used kindly, but all data could, even inadvertently, end up being used in an unkind or even violent way. So we need
Yeah.
to be cognizant of that risk and be careful with all of the data we're using. If we have
Yeah.
one piece of data, for instance, we've got Emma's most recent math grade, right? Then we've got one piece of data and it's really cold, really cold. If I just had one other piece of data to that, maybe her attendance over the last term, that has warmed up that first piece a little bit, and that first piece also warms up that attendance. If I then throw in a piece of socio-emotional learning data or well-being data, I've warmed it up still. If I then throw in a conversation I had with Emma's parents last week outside school, that warms it up still, and so on and so forth. The more pieces of data we have in the story, the warmer is that story. So no, not just demographics, absolutely not. Although I think that can be a valuable part.
Just
Of
giving
that
you an
life.
example, I mean, just a random statement that since we've started off a school year, we started off that in, July, in the month of July. And we've been doing a survey. I mean, we do a lot of survey. And in our school, there is a lot of data collection. But again, what we are lacking in is how do we analyze it and how are we using it to create a positive impact. Though we are very conscious as a school, we are working towards it. But as you say, the warm and the kind data, for example, I mean, just I'm taking a hypothetical situation that we've done a well-being, a survey with children. And there are certain questions from the data, it emerges that our children are not feeling comfortable talking to the homeroom tutor in case they are in trouble. So now this is one data that I would want my teachers, my counselors to work on so that my students are in a comfort space, in a comfort zone while they are in their classroom spaces. So now, how do I use this data? Because this can be brutal if not used in a a positive way. But how do I use this to be kind and warm and yet have an impact on student well-being?
Well, I've worked with schools for week-long residencies just looking at well-being data, right? So well-being data is a really complex field. And it's not just surveys, it's also observations, it's also check-ins. And we have to be just as nuanced with well-being data as we would with any other piece of academic data, for example. And surveys can be really well constructed, really poorly constructed, really well administered, really poorly administered, right? Do we get the right balance between anonymity and identifiability? Do we get the right balance between them being constructed in-house or being outsourced? Do we get the right balance between standardization and simply a raw response? Do we get the right balance between confidentiality and sharing? And I think, therefore, it's really hard to answer that specific question in a succinct enough way for this audience here, because we've got to make sure that the wellbeing data in the first place is of a sufficiently high quality and sufficiently kindly administered and collected and analyzed and shared that actually it will be a force for good. Because you could just as easily have academic data, which is really, really kind, and well-being data, which ends up being really, really used cruelly, right? If, for instance, there was a survey done on my class and the results were just given to me and it said that Emma doesn't like her teachers, right? Then instantly that's created conflict, it's created tension, it's created fear, it's created anxiety. So I think we're going to get the well-being data right before we then look at how the well-being data interacts with all the other pieces. But if, for example, we had really authentic and careful and considered well-being data that suggested that students in our grade 5 didn't, enough of them didn't feel comfortable talking with their homeroom teacher if they had in some way transgressed against the school's rules, then that's a piece of data around that cohort. But I want to be looking at, okay, in addition to them not feeling comfortable, what is this behavior that we're talking about, these transgressions? What are the reasons for them getting into trouble? Is it because of a lack of compliance conformity? Is it a lack of adherence to health and safety rules? What exactly are the behaviors that are getting them into trouble? Because unless I know that, I can't deal with them being in trouble as something simple on its own. And for each kid, it'll therefore be different. And for each kid, they'll all have their own different context. So it's hard to oversimplify. It's important that we don't oversimplify it, I think, which probably hasn't answered your question succinctly, but it's not a succinct question to answer.
But I do get it that from where we ever see that there is a disparity, we need to get back to the roots of it, that what made the child respond in a particular way and analyze the background and hence look at the data from a fresh lens.
It's exactly. I wrote a 2-part article for International Teacher magazine over the summer, which it may be worth you looking for. And it was entitled, What Would Happen If We Banished the B Word in Schools? By which I meant the behavior word, because it seems to me the behavior isn't a thing. Behavior in schools typically means a lack of compliance and conformity. Whereas in the adult world, a lack of compliance and conformity often is the foundation stone for people being most successful and innovative and impactful members of society possible. But in schools, we want them to comply and conform. So I think, yeah, understanding what we mean by behavior is really important to that discussion as well.
Thank you. That answers my question.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think Ambika had a question as well. Or anybody else?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute. I was just wondering, I get, the question, the previous question and the answer, and I do see that we have to use data in a holistic manner, looking at other aspects and not in isolation to get the true picture. But sometimes I feel when we do survey, right? And surveys are a very important source of information, or data collection, because it's it's a first hand account of how the person who's taking the survey feels, right? But many a times I feel sometimes the questions are misinterpreted, or sometimes it can, the way they respond to the questions can also be affected by their state of mind. So, is there any, advice or any tips to, collecting data in that is more authentic, and avoiding such, factors that could, kind of uh, maybe dilute, or lead to any inaccuracies in the data that we're collecting?
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word accuracy there, because I think accuracy is a really problematic word when we look at data full stop, because that suggests that data can be true or not true. It can be factual or not factual. And I think we need to be careful around that, because ultimately any piece of data is simply offering us a flag beneath which we should then go away and dig. I talk about data being a flag, not a fact, a question, not an answer. So I think we need to be cautious around thinking of data as accurate or not. And in terms of surveys, there's a whole world of science around the effective construction and administration of surveys. If I, as a student, feel safe completing the survey, if I understand every question in the survey, if I trust how that data, those responses are or aren't going to be used, with whom they are or aren't going to be shared, if I trust and believe there will be impact as a result of that data, if I know that if I'm really not in a good place today, I'm going to be given a chance to do the survey tomorrow, because what's the point in me getting to do it today if I'm having a really bad day? If all those things are in place, then you're going to get much more authentic responses. But in some schools, if none of those things are in place, then the survey data you get is next to useless, because it's being gathered in really crude conditions. So yeah, a survey is one particular type of well-being data. It's not the only piece of well-being data that we can gather. And there'll be many kids who, however good the survey is, however well administered it is, it still won't break through their mask. They will still be so much on the defensive that they won't actually be honest about it, which is why in the world of well-being data, we warm up survey data by having check-in data and by having observational data and by bringing academic data in to be well-being data too, and by looking at counseling data. Again, it's that process of warming up the cold with wider context.
Yeah, I just want to give a plug as well to yesterday, Monday, we had a similar talk from Nick Ponsford, who talked a lot about surveys and the work that they've done in exactly that, what you're talking about, making sure that the survey data is really valuable data by making it a safe space for the students. And her survey data results that just came out are really interesting too. So I really encourage you to check out that one, the replay.
Yeah, I'd second that. Nick's work with the Global Equality Collective is amazing. That they do surveys well, right? Still relies upon the school administering them with the same sort of consistency. But yeah, Nick's work's brilliant in that respect.
Matthew, I have a question that I'm scared might open up a whole new world of questions. But I'm thinking about your fractals, and I'm thinking, how do we see through the noise, and how do we know which stars make the constellation when we're just looking at all those fractals?
Well, in that instance, it's where I would rely upon, this seems like a shameless plug, it's where I would rely upon an effective analytics platform,
It
right?
seemed like I set that up really well, didn't I? That was not my intention.
Well, because if I'm a classroom teacher and I don't know, so I know classroom teachers who teach up to 200 kids in a week, right? I don't have the time to dig and dive into a whole field of data, right? To look up at that whole sky and to join all the different stars and dots
Exactly.
together. I need the dashboard and the analytics platform to have done a lot of that work for me. The leadership team, therefore, needs to be instrumental in developing and evolving that dashboard with the analytics platform itself, in this case, the LAC, so that the work is done, a lot of the work is done for that teacher. So I can then look and I can see in a snapshot, maybe in the 1 minute or so, I'm just looking at the class list at the on that particular lesson. There's a school I learned from a couple of years ago in Kuwait, where they have a system where they call it Blue Heart. So if, based on all of the data that the leadership team and the wellbeing team, the counselors, etc., are looking at, it looks like Emma needs a bit of extra TLC, a bit of extra love, then there's a blue heart put next to her name in the class list on the register. So I, the teacher, all I need to know is, you know what, Emma needs a bit of extra love today. Now, in order to decide which of the data pieces are most important and which are least, we need to remember the words of Alfred Korzybski, I think, who said famously, the map is not the territory. So we need to rely upon the relational warmth and the relationships within a school to complement the data map that an analytics platform will provide. If we're purely relying on that map, the map could almost perversely end up becoming quite a cold space, in the same way that if I have a map to help me get around a particular part of any country, that map will only have shown what the creator of the map thinks are the most important features in that particular landscape. Whereas it's only through my actually exploring that territory represented by that map that I'm truly going to get to know what is important to me within that landscape. And so much of effective data use is complemented by a powerful, safe, trusting, one-to-one relationship with at least one adult champion in the school. And that can help filter, I suppose, help steer the analytics towards what is most important for that kid or that group of kids. Does that answer to some extent?
Yes, thank you. I imagine it's also a really good opportunity for the school to like do some value setting exercises and things like that too, in working out.
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, what more matters to us? It wants to.
What matters
If
to
a school has identified the things that really matter to us and really matter to our kids, that will naturally lead to the prioritization of certain data stars. Now, if I were leading an academic hothouse where the key thing, whatever the emotional cost, and however many kids we needed to turn away at admission stage, the key thing was simply having the highest IB scores in the world, right? Then I wouldn't want to work in that school or lead it. But that school will, through those choices, have identified which of the data pieces are important and which are not. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of values work to be done in order to determine which of the stars are important and which perhaps can take second place. And we have to be cautious about not having too many priorities as well. Because if every piece of data is of equal importance, then it becomes, well, then they're all of just as little importance as well, because we can't possibly see through that noise, as you said.
Exactly. Yeah. Super helpful. Thank you so much, Matthew. And I'm going to stop the recording and